I have the unenviable task of introducing Vijay Prashad, our second keynote. I've known Vijay for almost 10 years, and in that time, I have heard many people introduce him. Now, normally, people always say that he is a prolific writer. He has written over 25 books from the darker nations. It's obscene, 25. It's obscene, 25 books. People always say he is a great editor because he has edited over 10 books, also obscene. He's the chief editor of Leftward Books. He is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Justice, for Social Research. And you can find some of the Tricontinental's new dossiers on the Word Up table. People usually introduce him as a consummate public intellectual who writes for a number of publications, including The Hindu, Frontline, Alternate, and Slate, all seemingly at the same time. Every single time I turn on my computer, he seems to have some new editorial or new interview or some clever little tweet. Vijay Prashad is undoubtedly the radical spam of social media. And people also tend to introduce him as a mentor. And I've met many people in this room actually, who have told me that he inspired them to become a writer, an intellectual, or a community organizer. And he is all these things: a writer, editor, mentor, and public intellectual. But for my introduction, I just want to say a few things about Vijay related to the way I know him best, as a coworker and a fellow teacher. Vijay and I worked together for 3 years at Trinity College, and I was so excited about being on the same campus and was very eager to talk with him about news and politics. I'm sure I was a pain in the ass. But along with many of our colleagues, people like Seth Markle, Devarian Baldwin, Johnny Williams, and Robert Cotto, we all agreed to have a regular Tuesday lunch together that was called Fries and Ferguson. And I was really hoping that we were going to use this lunch to talk about news and politics, but it basically devolved into a jolly professor's eating club. So we would meet every Tuesday at the same table in the student cafeteria. We would always laugh very loud enough to make the students at the other tables very uncomfortable. And sometimes we talked about politics, but mostly we just cheered each other on to eat bigger and bigger pieces of chocolate cake. It was all extremely unhealthy, but it was all a lot of fun. And working in a really challenging environment, it was one small sweet thing that we all looked forward to each week. I wanted to be a better intellectual working with Vijay, but I think he helped me become a better teacher and a better colleague instead. I saw Vijay at work, grading papers, which he made his students write by hand because he's a monster. I never saw him late for a meeting. And this was even if he had been in Beirut the night before or up at some ungodly hour being interviewed for a news program that morning. He taught me how to live your principles, that you can't be a radical if you don't pull your own weight at work, that if you do your job carelessly, messily, or lazily, then you make someone else's work, someone else's life harder. How can you talk about global transformation if you take your coworkers for granted? People sling a lot of mud at Vijay for his politics, but I can't say I've ever worked with a more consistent, reliable, or trustworthy person, even among those who say that they're very radical. He was thoughtful, and he made the lives of the people he worked with easier and better, including mine. Martin Luther King Jr. once told us that all labor has dignity. And this is a really hard principle to remember, especially when our work is so precarious and so uncertain, when our working conditions are increasingly cruel and unfair, and when sometimes it seems like employers, landlords, insurance companies, and cops are all conspiring together to invent crueler and crueler ways to intensify our exploitation. Who wants to think about the dignity of work when it is work that makes our lives so miserable? At the same time, we have to ask, how do we survive under capitalism with our humanity intact? And how do we begin to organize against it? I mentioned earlier today that a group of extreme right fascists went after our colleague at Trinity College with death threats, forcing him to move his family and forcing the school to close down. And after this, the faculty began organizing to support him. The basis of that organizing was not from the administration or any official body. It was from Fries and Ferguson, a small group who laughed together, cared for each other, who tried to make each other's loads a little lighter week to week. In an offhand remark at Trinity, Vijay once said that it would be great if maybe one day we could co-teach a course called Global Radicalism. He probably forgot that he said that. I didn't. So I left Trinity College and never had the chance to teach that course with him, but I'm so excited to have him here today at a conference that he helped in so many ways to inspire. In his work and in his life, Vijay has helped me understand internationalism in the way that someone else once described Che Guevara's internationalism as nothing more complicated than repaying our debt to humanity. We are very proud and deeply honored to have him here today for our second keynote address. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Vijay Prashad.
So embarrassed. Sorry. Sorry you had to sit through that. Christina should have sent me that as an email. In fact, it would be nice if you sent me that as an email. I'd read it every once in a while on a particularly depressed day. Thanks, Jordan, Manu, Christina, for putting this together. Isn't this a great place? I mean, it's incredible. It's the middle of New York City, and here we have the movement incubator. It's incredible. And we have to use it, and we have to keep it alive. Nothing happens by itself. It's so important that people put themselves to building institutions. You know, the point isn't for us to have good ideas. The point is to translate good ideas into institutions, into new societies, in fact, to transform the world. No revolution has come merely from good ideas. Revolutions come from a great deal of hard work and building, of course, places like this, you know, which become the detonators. And by the way, I don't mean that literally. Hard to say who's, you know, in the room these days in the United States. They, after all, have these sweeping generalizations called material support. God knows what that means, you know. So many decent people are incarcerated in the United States based on material support laws. You're never sure what they're going to take the right way. But what I want to talk about in the very generous time you've given me is basically to echo what the previous panel had laid out and to bring it to the present. You know, for a very long time, Lisa, my colleagues, our colleagues in India, Suchetna, Archana, we have created a communist history group. And out of that group, the first volume of our endeavor appeared called Communist History, in which Lisa and Margaret had essays. And they were superb essays. It's a book you've never ever heard of or read because it's published in India. And because it's published in India and because of the International Division of Book Publishing, it has never crossed your path. You know, this whole idea of globalization is a fraud. What globalization means is the stuff you produce in the West comes to the rest of the world. But what is produced in New Delhi is not read in New York City. But still, this volume, Communist History, was, I think, an important intervention, or so we thought. In our part of the continent of the planet Earth, it was a very important intervention. I'm going to draw from the introduction I wrote to that volume quite a bit because it echoes the previous panel in, I think, some important ways. But I also want to talk about what happened after 1991. And in a sense, how we've been intellectually defeated. And I want to spend more time on that, if you don't mind. But I'll put the two together. I want to start, because we are in New York City, with a terrific play written by Tony Kushner, which you may or may not have seen or read. And it's the part of his very large and wonderful body of work called Perestroika. It's a great play, and I recommend you read it. In the opening of Perestroika, the scene is wonderful. It's the Great Hall of the People. Now imagine, it's the last 5 or 6 years of the USSR. In the Great Hall of the People, the delegates are discussing the question of what is this glasnost? What is this perestroika? Gorbachev and the other revisionist surrenderists were leading the charge to dissolve the Soviet Union essentially. And out of the shadows comes Comrade Antediluvievich. Those who are clever with English get the joke. Antediluvievich, the comrade who comes from basically before time, let's say. He comes there shriveled over, and stands in front of the people and he says, when I was young, we had a theory. He said, we had a theory. The theory guided us to make a revolution. He's the world's oldest Bolshevik. He remembers 1917, last year, 100 years ago. We had a theory that led us, the theory of the worker-peasant alliance, led us not only to overthrow the Tsar, but to prevent the bourgeoisie from taking us back to the war. We had a theory. And he says, you NEP men, referring to the new economic policy in the 1920s, you NEP men, you shriveled excuses of humanity, he says, what is your theory? He says to, what is your theory? Do you have a theory? He said, if you had a theory, you who want to dissolve the USSR, if you have a theory, I'll come with you to the mountain. We'll stand together and we'll watch the new dawn rise. He says, but you don't have a theory. And then there's the best line in the play. He says, even a snake, when it sheds its skin, has another skin that it's grown. Do you have a new skin, my little serpents? In 1991, something catastrophic happened. And it's hard to explain in New York City the nature of the catastrophe. It was 27 odd years ago. Many people in the United States lived under the shadow of the Cold War, McCarthyism, with their own perspective about the socialist bloc, their own ideas about, I don't know, what do the Trotskyites always say? State capitalism, degenerated, this, that, and the other. I mean, the best slogans possible to describe what had happened to the lands on the other side of the Iron Curtain. In many ways, the theory inside the West had already prepared the West or Western left to celebrate the collapse of the Soviet Union. Your attitude towards the collapse of the Soviet Union is so different from the attitudes in the Third World. So different. Because the experience of what the Soviet Union was different. But I'm not going to get into all that, because that'll take me far afield. I want to talk about what the consequences, intellectual consequences of the defeat of the Soviet Union, its disappearance from world history, what that has meant for us. The first, I think, thing that we need to just put into a basic understanding of intellectual life after 1991 was that we completely erased everything that happened on the other side of the Iron Curtain. For instance, take the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. After 1991, it was assumed that East Germany was a Stasi state. You didn't need to know anything else about it. From the first entry of Soviet troops into the eastern half of Germany until 1991, it has no history. It is merely a police state. Once you allow imperialism to define entirely the history of the Soviet bloc, once you allow imperialism to do that defining, you don't need to know anything about it. Nothing else is necessary. You remember that film about the Stasi agent listening to the couple That's all you need to know, that it was the Stasi everywhere. You don't need to know, for instance, that so many students from the continents of Africa and Asia particularly studied in East Germany, in the DDR. They were not communists, by the way. They came to do university there because university was virtually free for them. They went back home as engineers, as doctors, as teachers, as professionals. They didn't experience the DDR in this monochromatic way. I'm not saying the DDR didn't have a lot of problems, friends. That's not the point of what I'm saying. But if you're a sensitive historian, surely it's not enough to condemn an entire part of the globe, at least 60 years of its history, into a two-word line, police state. Surely that's not, sensible people know that that's not sufficient. I mean, you want me to have a nuanced understanding about the United States. You want me to be nuanced about the United States. You want me to talk about labor movements and the civil rights movement and the women's movement. Meanwhile, this country is destroying every country on the planet. You want me to be excised about Russian interference in the American election. Meanwhile, which election has the United States not interfered in? Nuance is allowed for the West. But there's no nuance allowed for anywhere else in the world. We're not allowed to understand complexity. So the first casualty of the defeat of 1991 was the real existing history of everything the other side of the Iron Curtain was erased. So once you erase that, socialism is a real penalty. We can't talk about the fact that they experimented with making societies where houselessness was not a problem. You see, you just walk in this city anywhere, you will see people sleeping on cardboard boxes. It's an abomination. Today, Christina gave you that line from James Baldwin. Two people are sitting in a room, right? There's a dead body under the table, correct? And he says if two people don't say anything, then speech is going to disappear. We lost our moral compass. You can walk down the street, see people without houses, starving, children being poisoned by water supplies in Flint and God knows where else. This is all part of the normal course of life. But here was an experiment to erase houselessness, to erase hunger. It was an experiment. That's the word I want us to use. Because experiments bring history back. We need to recover that history. Otherwise, we cannot come out of the defeat. Second, we have to recognize that as a consequence of the collapse in 91, it was not the left that disappeared in the third world. It was the left that disappeared in the West. It didn't even disappear in Japan. The Japanese Communist Party, whether it's social democratic or we can debate all that, continues to have a role in Japanese society. But in the West, the communists surrendered completely. Social democrats surrendered completely, willingly. Where are the parties in the West? They vanished after 91. Some of this was that they were a victim again. If we go back to Comrade Anti-Diluvievich, they were a victim of Eurocommunism. They were a victim of Browderism. They were a victim of their own illusions, which didn't put them at the heart of the working class movement in these societies. Maybe they didn't pivot swiftly enough to deal with the facts of what we call globalization. But certainly there was an ideological and institutional surrender in the West. To recapture that movement is essential. You cannot have a global left unless there is a left in the West. You cannot actually, and this goes back to the point you were making, Lisa, about the Beijing conference. You cannot have global victories unless there is a robust left inside the United States that's smashing this military enterprise. I don't just mean the US military, but arms sales. People in Yemen being killed daily because of US and British arms sales to the Saudi regime. You got to have a strong left in the United States to destabilize the militarism. You cannot build socialism in Venezuela. And some of you will say, oh, Venezuela, so many mistakes. You know, for all the complaints you have about the Venezuelans, what have you done here to destabilize the financial power of the United States, to shut the taps on credit to any country that they don't want to see lubricated with finance? It's not a question of you spending your time judging countries around the world. The responsibility, and I take this from the understanding in Beijing, the responsibility is to build a movement here. That was a major casualty of 1991. You cannot have internationalism, just to draw from Ani's point. You cannot have internationalism based on liberal sympathy. I feel bad for the people of Yemen. You have to have a concrete understanding of the situation, and that concrete understanding today would lead you to put at the center the question of the arms industry and how the United States as a country benefits from selling basically mechanisms of death to people around the planet. Third, intellectual defeat. You know, it's really interesting, and this is there in the Communist History Project that we have. It's really interesting how in the 1990s, theories of spontaneity arrived as the new explanation for everything. In other words, the concept spontaneity, which in Marxist theory has a very particular resonance, was taken out of its context and began to mean, let the people do things. People are doing things. You know, it became this banal idea. Look, they're doing things. Look, they're doing things here. The scholar's role now was merely to point fingers. They're doing things there. They're doing things there. They're doing things there. Why? How? How are they doing things? People don't just do things. They have to organize things. When Rosa Luxemburg wrote, I think, quite seriously about the concept spontaneity within a Marxist framework, she was interested in the dialectical interplay between spontaneity, organization, and vanguardism. In other words, she was trying to write in a context where political party of the people must not believe that it is the main driver, main force of history, but must understand that it works alongside the currents of working people, where there might be spontaneous outbreaks of rebellion which the party must be engaged with. That was her point. Her point wasn't that people just rise up, you don't need organization. It was not so banal. But by the way, new social movement theory. Now, I know I'm caricaturing this entire school of thought, but I would like to say to this school of thought, including Chantal Mouffe and Laclau's terrible book, published in the 1980s, 85. Terrible book. So-called post-Marxist book. That book pillories the entire tradition of Marxism. So why should I give them back the courtesy of nuance when they did not give my tradition any courtesy? That book made a mockery of Rosa Luxemburg. If you know your Rosa Luxemburg from the Mouffe and Laclau book, you'll never understand the real Rosa Luxemburg. Because they don't care about, they are using Marxism to push anti-Marxism and open a door, therefore, for left-wing people to become liberals. Because what happens with new social movement theories, you don't need organizations anymore. You just have people rising up. Zapatistas rise up. It's not true. It's not true. It doesn't work like that, friends. They spend years building with each other. They build confidence with each other. They build communities out of their own community bonds. They utilize the bonds of history and radicalize them. Bonds of family, bonds of community, bonds of fellowship. They are radicalized. Those bonds exist already, or they are built. But what this theory Social movement, what it does is, it means you can go back and you can write a history book without having the organizers. I find this amazing. These books are still written till this day. There'll be a book about a strike, trade union strike. But the activities of the union vanish, and even more strikingly, the communists disappear. There are no communists in these histories. Or they become, as Margaret says, black radicals. Suddenly, their politics is, I think that's actually the highest form of racism. Because you haven't taken the people seriously. They have ideas. They are not merely black radicals, which is a reduction of a person to what you think is their identity. You don't understand that the black radical tradition is a rich engagement with Marxism, with anarchism, with all kinds of currents of the left. It's not merely about identity. It's ridiculously infantilizing of the people that built organizations. You can't just look back at history and say that that work didn't matter. You know, Ani made a point which I think is so important and needs to be made over and over again. That in our work, we don't effectively celebrate the tedium of radicalism. You see, here's what I'm interested in mentioning. Part of new social movement theory was the idea that in rebellions, you get a good idea of social structure. But if you merely look at the rebellion, you've missed the part before the rebellion. Because actually, everything interesting is before then. It's how people build rebellions. And you see, if you're teaching young people in this age after 1991 about these great rebellions, 1968, Paris, it disarms young people. Because then they think, how will I do anything? I live in the most boring time. I don't know how to make anything. They think, oh my God, there's no spontaneous uprising in my area. So suddenly, you've made them without the tools to build anything. So when the moment arises, 2007, 2008, 2009, and young people decide to go and occupy Zuccotti Square, there's no theory to help them. They come there correctly. They are responding correctly to the moment. But there's no theory. Then you'll say, what theory? Are you being overly intellectual? I'm talking about Antediluvievich. If you didn't have a theory, he said, I'm not coming with you. How are you going to make this occupation into transformation? What is your understanding of how you got there and where you're going? This is the side of intellectual life where we suffered, I would say, our most catastrophic defeat. It's not in necessarily forgetting what happened in the Soviet Union, but it's in this. Because you've disarmed generations of people from serious political discussion about how you build to transform. It's not enough to use neoliberalism as an explanation for everything. I read so many books where people say neoliberalism this, neoliberalism that. Neoliberalism is like the boogeyman, like a monster. The question isn't what's bad. Are we teaching young people how to transform? How to take the energy that they feel and build something different? Finally means of this, then I'm going to tell you two quick stories. Don't worry. Finally, it's important to recognize that in the rest of the world, the left did not surrender. And partly because it had already started developing its own understanding of its revolutions. I mean, take the case of India, which I know well. The Communist Party in India splits in 1964. The largest section of the splits because they believe that the Soviet Union is too directive in telling the party how to understand its own reality. The other split was on an analysis of what is the nature of the Indian bourgeoisie. These debates are rich in the rest of the world. They've been happening in these movements. They've already in 1964 decided that the Soviet Union isn't the center of their existence, but it is an important part of the world revolution. So when the Soviet Union collapses, these organizations don't collapse, they continue. But in the literature about them, even written in India, they are an embarrassment. The left is an embarrassment to scholars of the left. Scholars of the left would like a different kind of left. They would like a left which is perfect. They would like a left that never makes an error. They would like a left that is absolutely understanding of all the intersections that they are interested in. And if the left hasn't already sorted all this out, it is worthless. So, in other words, what I learned from this attitude is that the intellectual is perfect. Because the intellectual has transformed all these contradictions. I would recommend you go back and read Marx, early Marx, where he writes, the state assumes that it has liberated itself from the contradictions of society. And it banishes the contradictions to society. And it stands apart and condemns society. Sometimes I feel like left intellectuals have this attitude. You sit somewhere remote and you condemn society. You see yourself as advanced. I am, what are the things? I've forgotten suddenly. There are many arrows that sling through you. Anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-misogynistic, help me, what are the other arrows? Decolonial, anti-fascist doesn't exist anymore because anti-Trump, I think, is a more specific thing. I am somehow immune because I have removed myself. These movements but these movements are messy because they live in the world. The American poet Muriel Rukeyser really put it well when she said that communists are exiles from the future. I mean, it's difficult, guys, to change the world. It's really difficult because the weight of history is burdensome. I mean, don't think that it's easy to move the world. And because one has the correct ideas, therefore one is liberated from the work of moving the world. The job of the intellectual isn't to have the correct ideas. The job of the intellectual is to interpret the world in order to transform it. So one looks then at these parties that exist in the rest of the world and there is an edge of embarrassment because they keep doing wrong things. But they are not homogeneous. Inside them, people are arguing, fighting, having debates, just as in 1964 in the Indian Party, there was a major debate. In China, now you see, in the West, we want to have this discussion. Is China communist or has it restored capitalism? This is a classic discussion one hears at, say, what is it called? So it's not called Socialist Scholars anymore. Left Forum. Classic discussion. Is China... Who are you to condemn it like that? Is that the best framing you can come up with? Why don't you ask a different question? What do Chinese intellectuals think about what's happening in China? Or ask an even deeper question. What is the debate inside China around the question of socialism? I would like to hear that discussion, not your understanding of whether it's restored. So you, like the Pope, will now decide whether to excommunicate 1.4 billion people from the camp of socialism. It's not up to you. I want to hear what they're debating because it's their reality. It's their reality more than your reality. For you, it's an article in a magazine. For them, it's what they have to live every day, how they build their own country. So you've got to have an attitude towards these revolutionary movements, however messed up they are. We have to have an attitude of understanding, not an attitude of benediction. Now, I said that I would bring your story, which, it was such a rich panel because so much to talk about. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the Comintern. And by the way, this right-wing paper called me a self-described Marxist. I don't understand what this self-described business is, firstly. Secondly, I'm not just a Marxist, I'm a communist. So, it would have been a better headline. So, next year is the 100th anniversary of the Comintern. Now, face it, the Comintern lasted from 1918 to 1943. I mean, that's actually, if you don't mind me saying so, I think that's younger than everybody in this room. I think. Some people may be younger than that, but most people have lived longer lives than the Comintern lived. And yet we think of the Comintern as this sort of endless project. It had a very brief historical, very brief role in the world. But even though its role was so brief, the impact it had was incredible. So, I mean, just breathe in a little bit when you think of concepts like Comintern. Think about it, from 1919 to 43, that's all it had. The impact was incredible. This is not again to say that in Moscow, they had everything figured out. By the way, if you go to South American history, the history is even worse, because they were only able to hold one meeting of South American communist parties in 1929. After that, they just shut up shop, because there was a huge debate on the indigenous question, between Maria Tegue's people and the Argentinians and so on. This has to do with the Andes versus the Southern Cone, I think, a lot of this. But at any rate, it's a very small history. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, and indeed before then, internationalism on the left had become very complicated. Comintern ends in 1943. In the 1950s and 60s, Moscow tried to hold meetings of the international workers and communist parties. The main one was in 1960. But already the communist bloc was totally fractured between China and the USSR, then the very important questions of Albania and Yugoslavia. I mean, it really takes a communist nerd to follow the internal debates between Albania and Yugoslavia, and it's incredible. I mean, you can't imagine. In the West, they said the communist bloc, but actually these people were, I don't know what the proper animal is that just squabbles with each other, but it's that kind of animal that squabbles all the time. Humans. In 1993, after the collapse of the USSR, the communist movement in India held a symposium in Calcutta, where they invited communist parties from around the world with relatively similar lifeboat situations. While others were sinking, these had survived. And they held a very important and good seminar in Calcutta about the future of the world communist movement and how to create new international networks. I'm going to introduce you to very quickly I'm going to introduce two networks. One is the International Communist Network, and the other is a network that comes out of Latin America. And then I'll end there. So after this Calcutta meeting, the KKE, the Greek Communist Party, held a meeting in 1999 of the International Communist and Workers' Parties. And this group has met every year since. They had their last meeting in Moscow, which was the biggest meeting. They celebrated the anniversary of the Russian Revolution and so on. They've had a hard time finding a way to, expand their influence, reach out to other movements. They've also had a hard time telling people about their existence. There's a website, there's a journal, there's all that. But these are parties with tens of millions of people around the world. This is not a marginal effort. There are tens of millions of people that belong to these organizations, from Belgium to India, Cuba, and I'm not even adding in the Chinese, because then it's unfair. And it's also slightly inaccurate to look at Chinese numbers. But this dynamic of international workers and communist party is one front, institutional front, to conceptualize again internationalism. The second front comes out of Latin America. It's interesting that when books are written about globalization or anti-globalization, Seattle takes center stage. In fact, there was an event here, the first event here, where somebody said, I was inspired by Seattle. But of course, Seattle wasn't the beginning of that. In fact, if you truly believed in Laclau move type spontaneity, you might have seen that the beginnings were elsewhere in what were known as IMF riots or bread riots. Whether it's in fact, in Egypt, it's even earlier, it's in the 1970s. But you see these in West Africa, and then culminating in 1992 in the Caracazo in Venezuela, in Caracas. This anti-globalization sensibility that comes out of working class neighborhoods of cities in the global south. These movements emerge out of slums, actually. Whether it's in Nigeria or, as I said, in Caracas, these are movements that emerge out of slums. By this period, about 1 billion people in the world were living in slum-like conditions. They were producing goods for the international commodity or the global commodity chain. They were not left outside, etc. There are places in Ghana, in Accra, or in Lagos, Nigeria, where your computers go inside the slum to be broken up and precious metals taken out and so on. These places might look like they exist outside the realm of capitalism, but they're actually quite fundamental to the recycling of precious metals and so on. And also manufacturing of small parts for various things. Talk about super exploitation of labor. So this new kind of politics that emerged, these uprisings, protests, etc., became very quickly institutionalized in Latin America around new movements. Now, it's important to understand that Latin American history is a peculiar history because the left there was actually killed off, just as they were in the Arab world. In Argentina, 30,000 people, an entire generation's left, was massacred during the military dictatorship. Between 1976 and 1982, 30,000 trade unionists, college militants, and so on were killed. It's not just that they killed people, by the way. They killed the cream of the left. An entire generation of the left was wiped out. In other countries, the left basically surrendered. There, they were killed. So when these movements emerge in countries like Argentina or Venezuela, etc., often there is no section of the left to provide leadership for the movements. Leadership comes from young people who are learning how to do this without the wisdom of the elders. And they build new kinds of organizations. Now, again, this era will come. People will look at those organizations and say, these are new kinds of organizing. You see what happens? Suddenly, it becomes convenient for new social movement to say, look at the organizing in South America. It's not like the old organizing. Well, my friends, it's not like the old organizing because old organizers were killed. You see, it's not that, it's a new form. Now let's take the South American model to Asia. Doesn't work like that. You can't, that's not internationalism, by the way, transposing experience of one place to another. It's opposite. Internationalism means you have some respect for the coherent histories of the place. Not that you just cookie cutter take from one experience and place it somewhere else. Out of this, of course, came the victories of the governments of the left in Latin America. And at the time, when Chavez was alive, they created the ALBA network, the Bolivarian area of the Americas. And the ALBA government network was being created up here, and down here, ALBA social movements network was being created. See, when you look at the World Social Forum that started in Porto Alegre in Brazil, this is also written about as if it's part of the story of ATTAC in France and NGOs. But underneath that, there is an infrastructure. After all, they chose Porto Alegre because the Workers' Party had won the city government. Workers' Party came out of the fight against the dictatorship, which ended in 1985. This Workers' Party was one with the other ALBA-type organizations in the area. It had some differences with the network, but they were linked together. The experience of the World Social Forum was the first new attempt made by the Latin American left to create a new kind of internationalism. Remember, the first is there's the international working class and communist parties. That continues. But now there is this new thing, the World Social Forum. In 2009, the ALBA Network and others had a special meeting parallel to a World Social Forum where they decided the World Social Forum itself hadn't succeeded in its objective. In other words, it had succumbed to NGOism. Half the people at some of these World Social Forums were from the United States. People were not coming from Asia in large enough numbers, not coming from Africa. You know, the advantage of the Soviet Union was that the Soviets used some of the surplus that the state had to create the infrastructure for internationalism. It cost money for people to travel. However difficult it is, you board a ship somewhere, whatever. It costs money to set up the School of the Toilers of the East. Those things don't just happen. It costs money to create an institution like this. Everything costs money, meaning it costs resources. So the ALBA movement in the 2009 meeting decided a new dynamic had to be opened up. And they started talking about the dilemmas of humanity as a way to have a conference every year to bring people from China, from India, to sit down and have a discussion. How do we overcome the dilemmas of humanity? It's a terrific phrase. Those conversations deepened. And then this movement said, now we're going to create a new kind of World Social Forum. But this time, we're not going to invite anybody to come who can afford to, because then the Ford Foundation kicks in. Soros kicks in. They suddenly fund 25 of their grantees to go. You don't want that. So the new formation, the international assemblies of the people, was going to be organizations invited by the International Secretariat of this assembly to meet and have a conversation about how to deepen the network. And this meeting is going to happen next year in Caracas, Venezuela. And organizations are going to come from Malaysia, they will come from Zambia, they will come from all across the planet. The discussions, preliminary discussions on the International Assembly are very productive because everything we've been talking about has come back to life in a different context. It's not like the discussions in either the International Workers and Communist Party or the International Assembly. It's not like they're unaware of the centrality of the fight for the dignity of people. You know, each of these formations understands fully what now is called intersectionality. Because after all, friends, they have had organizing experience. That if you, in organizing, ignore somebody's hurt, you are not going to create comrades. In the experience of organizing, if you say to somebody, look, I know that you have some problems as a woman, but we are just a class here. You know that in organizing, that's not a successful method. I'm not talking about high theory here. For an organizer, you're not building committed people who say, my hurt is inside this movement. My hurt is going to be addressed. Now, this is not to say that these movements have understood a credible way to do this. But the one thing I can say is they don't have to be lectured about its importance. What they need is for intellectuals to study what they're doing and help them find better ways of doing what they're doing. You don't need to tell somebody who's in a political party, why aren't you dealing with gender? It's extraordinarily arrogant thing to say to a political party in some of these parts of the world. You go to the Socialist Party of Zambia, why aren't you dealing with gender? I mean, how can they even begin to organize if the question of women's emancipation isn't in the heart of their movement? But where they fail is what to do about it. They don't necessarily know everything. Nobody is saying that. Which is why the role of the intellectual in our time, especially when these movements are afoot, has to be of a different character. Remember, I said one of the problems we face is the question of what is the intellectual's role? Is the intellectual's role to condemn things? That is a counterproductive role. The better role is to put all that learning that we have to work, to study contradictions around and inside movements and address them for the benefit, not of the movement, but the benefit of all of us to solve the dilemmas of humanity. Because these are dilemmas. Nobody has the answer. When Antediluvievich says, if you have a theory, I'm coming up to see the dawn rise, he's talking about a theory. We know what the word theory means. Theory doesn't come from God. It's not a God perspective kind of thing. A theory is a provisional understanding of how to move forward. It could be a program. It could be a strategy which has within it a set of tactics and so on. Theories aren't the be-all and end-all. They're a map. When Antediluvievich said, if you have a theory, I'll come with you, he's saying, if you have a map, where are you going, you little serpents? He says, in the great hall of the people. And that's a question I want to ask all of us. Where are we going, serpents? Let's grow a new skin. Thanks a lot.
My question more regards like social media activism in today's age. And like, what do you see the role of younger generations and their use of social media in different activism forms?
These are just methods of communication. And all methods of communication are important. You know, I could have gone on and talked about the battle of ideas. You know, we are in a real battle right now. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry. I forgot to bring it earlier. We are in a real battle of ideas. I mean, look at this in the question of the US Supreme Court. Just, I mean, as an example. It's a battle of ideas. Why? You have this guy who's going to be on the Supreme Court who raped somebody when he was a teenager. And apparently he was drunk. So now the battle of ideas is the following. When a woman is drunk and raped, you blame the woman. When the man is drunk and raped, you blame the woman. That's basically the understanding of the bourgeoisie. So you're in a serious battle of ideas. You have to reclaim what it means to discuss something like this kind of violence. So now if you're having the debate in social media or in person, I don't care. I find it ridiculous when people say, oh, social media, it's nothing. It's another form of communication. Let's not make it into a great thing. Let's not deride it. It's just another way of having a conversation. So good on you, social media warriors. Cadre of social media. But don't become the party of social media.
That was excellent. And also, at least in the American sphere, like one thing to really consider is how convenient it is to deny after 1991 that it's like a failure. It's a 0 or a 1. If only because of like how now we'll see like Black identity extremists, people who are operating like Black Lives Matter are labeled as that by the FBI and followed. It's very easy to now like deride their ideas. So if you're online, if you're on social media and you say something that's like more radical left, you'll just be discounted as either a robot or just like a random extremist Russian bot. And it's a really easy way to discount this more like radical, very real radical practice that's happening in social media spaces. And also purposely because it's like a democratization of like, I can talk to you even if you're in Seattle, blah, blah, blah. And my question was, in India, those conversations are happening between the two communist factions amongst themselves and with each other. What do you think help them weather the storm, so to speak? And also like that idea of purity, needing to have intellectual purity. Either you're a good person or you're a bad person, you're an abuser or you're abused. Like these binaries, how do you think when in those spheres they like reckon with them so that we can actually deal with each other like as dynamic human beings in space and time who are like changing, shifting, both abuser and abused, and like all this different stuff that is like part and parcel of what a communist anarchist type movement would be?
It's a very good question. I don't want to exaggerate the problems but let's start from a simple gesture. I think it's fair to have an understanding of who are the friends of the people, if I can take the old Maoist line, and who are the enemies of the people. You know, in very many countries, the friends of the people are the biggest enemies of each other. Case in point, United States. I mean, the left hates each other more than they hate the bourgeoisie. You know, I find it extraordinary. On the case of the war in Syria, let's take it as an example, directly as an example. People who don't know anything about Syria attack each other virulently. When they need to be out there building a movement against militarism in this country, I mean, what that attack leads you to is to a curious position where you might defend American bombing of Syria. That's what sectarianism leads you into. You lose focus on understanding the problems in the world. You know, I would say that that's one issue. That the friends of the people need to understand you can have differences, but you should not tear each other apart. Imagine if you are not part of a sectarian group, how horrible the left looks. You know, if you are a person of sensitivity, working class organizer of sensitivity, you'll run away from the left because they spend the whole day maligning each other. You see, it's important what you had said earlier about making some of these ideas look good. Remember the idea that socialism has to also look good. You see, the bourgeoisie has done its job in making socialism look like a horrible thing. But if you guys are like animals with each other, who's going to say, I'm dying to become a socialist? You have to make your own understanding of what is more important. Winning the most correct position award or building a movement. See, right now, these people are winning as socialists. And online, there are people saying, but they're not socialists. They are making this bad statement, that bad statement. Friends, be patient. You're building a movement. You're not winning a prize. You're not playing Jeopardy. It's not about having the right answer in a game show. If you're building a movement, be patient with each other. Build each other's confidence. Right? So, but I did like your understanding of the 0-1 binary question. Some binaries are productive. Some are not. Yeah, please.
I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about why you think the West, the Communist Party in the West dissolved when it didn't dissolve in other parts of the world like India and Egypt and Japan. And I'm thinking back when HUAC was alive and well, and the phrase that they used to condemn you for being on the left was you were un-American. Now, there aren't any other countries that I know of that have an un-English or un-Japanese person, but you could call a person un-American, and that, you know, kind of dissolved their whole sense that they had any kind of patriotism at all. So were there greater forces arrayed against you in the United States if you were on the left than there were in these other countries, or different kinds and more pernicious forms of attack on you here?
It's a very good question, but I just want to say that in India, for instance, the phrase de jure is anti-national. Not necessarily anti-Indian, but anti-national. So our young comrades just won the election in Jawaharlal Nehru University on a united left platform, 4 left student organizations combined. And the defense minister of India made a statement saying anti-nationals in this college are waging war against India, which is ridiculous. I mean, why should the defense minister of the country make a comment about student elections? They're that fragile. The right is that fragile. It's like, you see, in this sense, Donald Trump is not an exception. The right is extraordinarily fragile. Partly because they have no agenda. and I'm going to come back to what you're saying, but I just want to make a point related to the earlier thing. And the left here, when it recomposes itself, must be more confident with its ideas. See, we should not be so scared to say what we believe. We believe something, we should speak it. I find sometimes that in the conversations among academics, sometimes there is hesitancy to say what you believe because the structure has made people anxious about jobs. You make the whole thing precariat. You make the entire intellectual world precariat. So intellectualism gets the life sucked out of it. Then everything becomes about protecting your ability to get a job. It's a very clever maneuver by the right. But they are very fragile with their ideas. They have an easy time getting jobs. But they are fragile with their ideas. We have a hard time getting jobs, but we have the correct ideas. Why it dissolved here, I think, and maybe partly, some of it had to do with what I would think of as the era of theory. The revisionist theories that came, Santiago Carrillo's ideas in Spain of Eurocommunism. I think the impact of Broderism, even though Earl Broder was removed, Broderist ideas had a big role to play here. I mean, I agree. McCarthyism plays its role, takes a real toll. A generation is, lost to the left. And I think we need to recognize that. But the reconstruction of the left in the new period, 1960s onward, there was a revisionism there. By revisionism, that's our code word for what Margaret was talking about earlier, which is the idea that you can find a liberal section of the bourgeoisie to basically hold hands with. I think that idea comes very strongly. Bernstein's ideas from the turn of the previous century, that you don't need a revolution. You can win elections and evolve to socialism. That was Carrillo's ideas in Spain, in Eurocommunism. That was the ideas very much there in most of the southern European parties. The French also developed those ideas. I think this was before the Soviet Union collapsed. This was really disarming. Because, you're right, you're telling workers who now are in a new revolutionary situation. In other words, globalization has destroyed your livelihood. But they are not prepared with a theory to understand why they have no jobs. So Trump shows up and says, Mexicans, and they're, yes, Mexicans. We need to recover that theory. You can't fight Trumpism by saying, I'm not a racist. You have to fight Trumpism by offering a new theory of why people have no jobs and how you will produce a different situation. Because you will tax the rich. Because the rich don't deserve that kind of money. And you will provide new social fabric, which has been destroyed by Clinton and so on, leading to Trump. But we need a theory for that. We need to be aggressive. I don't mean aggressive like an aggressive person. I mean maybe bold. We need to be bold. We should not be diffident with these ideas because we do have the correct ideas. Thanks a lot. Thank you.